Public Diplomacy Division, Dynak Bhaskar Group, DNA, Glenlivet, Hindustan Times, The Hindu, Google, X News, Penguin, the British Council, Sula Wines, Jan Michalski Foundation, and JCB. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Michael Ondaatje and Amitava Kumar for From Ink Lake. This session is proudly supported by the Times of India. As is the usual format at the Jaipur Literature Festival, the conversation will run for about 50 minutes and will take around 10 minutes of questions at the end of the session. And Michael will sign books afterwards in the book tent at the opposite end of the property. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? You can hear me? Great. 50 minutes starting now? No.
Okay. Welcome, and thank you for being here, Michael. Michael Ondaatje, as everybody knows, is a winner of the Booker for The English Patient, and he has won numerous other prizes for his other works. 6 novels, a volume of autobiography, several volumes of poetry, a wonderful book on editing, which is a non-fiction collaboration between him and Walter Murch. In fact, it is safe to say that he has won every prize, other than perhaps the Man of the Match award in the World Cup final when Sri Lanka lifted the World Cup. So congratulations. I had wanted Michael to read a little bit, and hopefully in the middle of our conversation I'll press him to do so. The immediate occasion for our conversation is a new book, a novel that Michael has just published. It's a beautiful book. It's called The Cat's Table. And one of the immediate results of reading this book is that I've been tempted to cancel my flight and take a ship back to the place where I've come from. So that's the temptation that you might consider too. 3 boys are on a ship from Colombo to England, to Tilbury in England. And they are seated at the cat's table, which is the name for the table that is furthest from the captain's table. And from that vantage point, marginal, unimportant, that these adventures unfold. So, Michael, I understand that you too, of course, as a child, as a boy, undertook this journey. But what was the immediate occasion? What was the spark for writing this book right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I was 11 years old, rather like the boy in the novel, I went to Ceylon or Sri Lanka, to England, and I had no parents watching over me, so I felt tremendously independent for the first time in my life. And I was telling my children a few years ago about this, and they were horrified that a small boy would be put on a ship for 21 days and sent off to nowhere, essentially. And just from their reaction, I thought, my God, this is a really great story, especially as I really didn't remember that journey very much at all. It was like being given a gift of an episode in a life that could become a novel. And so I turned what was essentially autobiography or unremembered autobiography into fiction. And so apart from the fact that the boy gets on a ship at the age of 11 and goes to England, I had to invent every character. I had to invent Cassius and Ramadin, who are his 2 friends, and all the characters in the novel were invented. So that was really the source of the book.
For those of you who have read other books by Michael, there is always a discussion on art or on craft. You know, you're a person who's invested in dismantling bombs, for example. So there'll be a discussion about how you're to do that. In another book, someone is a bridge builder. So there'll be a discussion about the science or the art, really, of building bridges, right?
Yes.
Here, once again, there's a reflection even on stories, on storytelling. So, early in the book, the boy, Michael, Mina is his nickname, he says at some point, he says, unlike Mr. Mazappa, Mr. Neville was modest and would speak of these episodes in his past only if you knew how to nudge an incident out of him. If he had not been so modest in the way he responded to our barrage of questions, we would not have believed him or been so enthralled. So, Michael, is that how this interview is going to go? Will I have to nudge you and we will stay enthralled because you will give us a little bit and then not more?
Well, I kind of, you know, as someone who writes novels that are set in other periods of time or other ages or other landscapes, you know, there's a certain element of research I have to do. And often, the more laconic people are, the more interesting they become. And I remember I was talking to a farmer once about how one of his cows had gone through the ice and land, you know, was in frozen water. And he had to get the cow out, which sounded very dramatic. So I said, so how did you get the cow out? What was it like? And he said, it was very difficult. And that was all he said. And so actually, again, it was this kind of gift of, okay, I had to invent the story. I had to choreograph the scene, which went on for about 4 or 5 pages and not just one brief sentence.
Yes, yes. But you know, what I always think is that even when you offer us just a brief sentence, you're often so specific, so precise, that one gets an immediate picture. For instance, you know, I'm particularly drawn to people sitting in bathrooms and what they do. And here's the line. You squatted over the hole of hell and washed yourself afterwards with water from a rusty tin that once held Tate and Lyle golden syrup. It's not just any tin, right? And then this wonderful line, which is perhaps the slogan that appears on the tin, you know, at the advertisement. It says, out of the strong came forth sweetness. I would always remember. And indeed, as readers, we remember. I think, is that a part of your being a poet that gives to your writing such wonderful precision, so that there is always this specificity, even when you're offering these laconic lines?
Well, that was definitely not out of being a poet, but out of growing up in a school, in a boarding school in Sri Lanka, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when I began as a poet, and one of the elements of poetry is you try and not say everything. You try and say 2/3, so that the reader involves himself or herself and participates. And I think when I began to write novels, I wanted to keep that element of interaction between the reader in a not just for the reader to sit back and be told everything and to be shepherded from A to B to C to D,
yes,
but to participate. And the less you say sometimes, the better it is. You know, it's the way someone speaks very quietly, you kind of move forward.
Yes.
So you can listen more carefully.
Boss, मैं quietly बोल रहा था so that everyone could move forward. Yeah, I realized that, you know, as a young man, when I was in love, I would very immediately blurt out, I love you. But you would not have done that. You would have been...
I did actually, but anyway.
But you learned the lessons, and therefore your fiction has grown so much more richer, I think. Talking, you know, if you guys were paying attention, you heard Michael say that the sort of aesthetic principle he follows in his narrative is saying about 2/3. It's almost like a mathematical. And this reminds me that in the book of interviews that Michael did with Walter Murch, Michael describes watching a film where the cuts between different scenes are complete, so that each scene is whole in itself, and he found it dissatisfying. While in the case of Walter Murch held back about 1/5 of the narrative. Do I get that mathematical thing right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what happens there.
Well, I think one of the things he was talking about was when he edited the film of The English Patient, there was a scene between Caravaggio and Hannah, and then the scene was completely written from A to Z, and he held back the last, you know, 1/5, and you sort of heard it in the next scene. All the movies is a voiceover, and there's something about, you know, having a blackout at the end of every scene, that kind of, you know, that stop-start thing that in fact makes it exhausting for the reader or the viewer, and it doesn't make it exhausting for the viewer, but there's thus participation.
Yes.
You know, there always should be something hanging before when a scene ends, so that there's a reason for going into the next scene. So, I mean, I think I learned a lot from Merch in terms of how one doesn't want to be too, the scene shouldn't be too fulfilled.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm trying to connect this thing that Michael has just taught me to what I also think of as Michael's writing, his fiction especially, is a corrective to what has been withheld in history. By which I mean, a story has been told, but perhaps it has not been told adequately. Or there is another story beside it. In fact, I'm reminded that In the Skin of the Lion has an epigraph from John Berger, which was also used by Arundhati Roy as an epigraph in her novel. And it's basically, if I remember right, it goes something like, never again will a story be told as if it is the only story.
Yeah, yeah. Never again will a single story be told as though it were the only one. Yeah.
Yes. So, you are always telling that story as if it's not. No, you know, there are other stories in the margins also. Isn't that also true? Because, you know, let's say we encounter Kip in The English Patient. He's the sapper, the sick sapper. And he realizes that he's not the center of Europe, and he questions his own place in Europe. So you're also trying to tell a story from the side, you know, someone's from a position of marginality.
Except that I think, you know, I want the marginality to come into the center. You know, this is the thing. I mean, I grew up, you know, after I moved to England, I saw all these war movies that came out shortly after the war was over, all the essentially post-propaganda films. And they were all about Englishmen, or they were all about Americans. There were no Indians in it. And I knew that one of the things I really wanted to do was to try and, you know, bring Kip into the landscape of that history. And I think that's often the case. And I think the thing about Berger's remark is that, you know, it's an aesthetic remark, but also a political one.
Yes.
You know, I think aesthetically, you know, you have the novels, say, of Scott Fitzgerald, where Nick Carraway is the narrator, or so-and-so is the narrator, and everything is seen from that person's point of view. And I've tried in my novels to have various points of view, various speakers, various narratives. So it's more of a group dialogue as opposed to a monologue.
Yes.
But politically, I also don't believe anymore that we can only have one voice to a story. It's like having one radio station to represent a country.
Yes.
You know, you want the politics of any complicated situation to be complicated in a work of fiction or non-fiction.
Yes, yes. You know, you'd have expected a Scotsman to give you scotch, but he has just brought me tea. Last night I was at a dinner where they served you, I was served, the Ondaatje Slammer. Did you drink it by yourself? No, you didn't try it? Did you see it?
I didn't see it.
Oh, man.
I don't believe it either, actually.
It was a lovely drink. I enjoyed it very much. Yeah, well.
What were the ingredients? Do you know?
I put it on Twitter last night. So anyone is interested in the recipe for the Ondaatje Slammer, look it up under my name. You'll see it there. Michael just said that he's interested in it as an aesthetic issue, the issue of the margin coming to the center, but it's also a political issue. I'm reminded in this novel, there is a line. In fact, it was a very moving passage for me. When a letter arrives, many years after the narrator has met this woman on the ship, an older woman. And she has a desire to, as she describes in the letter, to rescue this other woman who she sees in a moment of danger with an older man. And she wants to warn him about it. And it was a lovely, lovely, lovely encounter, I thought. Especially because she is describing her past, her dealing as a young woman with a very powerful man. And it's done very delicately. And there's a line there which she offers. She says, when she says about these men talking with a sort of an easy wisdom, she says, they're also hiding something. She says, there is always a cup of blood somewhere. And I thought that was a statement about power.
Mm-hmm.
That you hear the easy rhetoric of someone. What you should always be looking for also is the brutality. You know, it's like reading against the grain.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. To see in civilization, you know what Benjamin said, to see in any document of culture also a document of barbarity.
Yeah. It's very odd because, you know, I mean, when I write my novels, I don't really have a huge plan beforehand. I don't have the whole plot
Yes.
and architecture. So the story is sort of discovered as I write it. And, you know, it's really not till much later on that you sort of can look back at the landscape of the book and say, oh, so that connects with so-and-so. So that the number of rhymes and echoes kind of reveal themselves. So the three boys, especially Maina, is very powerless, you know, in the book, and he's surrounded by people with power, you know, to a certain extent.
Yes.
And he's also surrounded by people who do not have power. So he's getting an education in this novel, you know, from good people like Mr. Fonseca and also quite bad people like the Baron, who's a thief. And so, you know, it became interesting that when I got to that letter by Miss Laskini, you know, she kind of focused on that, how we have to kind of invade power, or people with power, or how dangerous they can be, how charming they can be, as well as dangerous.
Yeah. I'm not wholly accepting of your description of them as bad people, because you present them also with a certain sympathy. I never thought, even the Baron,
Yeah.
when he instructs the little boy in crime, it seemed almost like a pedagogical act. You know what I'm saying? It was like, showing him a vocation or something like that.
Yeah.
So where does the sympathy of yours come from? Yeah, I mean, you're not savage.
No, that may be a problem with me. Who knows? You know, maybe it's going to come out someday in a brutal way. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I just get fascinated by the characters, you know. And you know, certainly I quite agree with it. The Baron is not a bad person. I mean, you can look at him from the distance and say this kind of man is a thief. But I tend to have a lot of good-natured thieves in my book.
Yes.
I don't know where that compassion comes from. No, I think the thing is that it's an 11-year-old boy telling the story to a certain extent. And then, so he's in awe of him. You know, it's not a case of good or bad. It's the way children are treated sometimes, and they're not judgmental about it. You know, go over here and do that. You know, you go and do it, and that's what's a given.
Yeah. We are going to have some brilliant conversation, but let's keep it hanging. Okay? Let's for a moment, can I invite you to read from the book, from the middle of the book maybe, yeah?
So the book covers this 21-day journey from Sri Lanka to England. And I mean, one of the things that happened was, when I was writing it, was I was wondering how many of us made that similar journey. You know, certainly our parents and our grandparents did. I mean, that generations of people from Asia or from the Caribbean who went to England in this way. And so one of the scenes is when they go through the Suez Canal on the ship. And this is a scene to do with that. We approached the canal in darkness at the stroke of midnight. A few passengers camped on the decks to take in the experience, were half asleep, scarcely conscious of the clangs and bells that guided our ship into the narrow eye of the needle that was El Suez. Paused to take on an Arab harbor pilot who climbed from his barge up a rope ladder. He walked slowly towards the bridge, ignoring all authority around him. This was his property now. He would be the one to take us into even shallower waters and adjust the angle of the ship so we could slip into the narrower canal on which traveled 190 kilometers to port side. We could see him in the brightly lit horizontal windows of the bridge beside the captain and two other officers. It was a night we never slept. In less than half an hour, we were sidling alongside a concrete dock with crates stacked into giant pyramids and men running with electrical cables and baggage carts alongside the slow-moving Oronze. Everywhere there was fast, intense work under the pockets of sulphurous light. We could hear shouts and whistles. The three of us hung over the railings, gulping in air, taking it in. This night turned out to be our most vivid memory of the journey, the time I stumble upon now and then in a dream. We were not active, but a constantly changing world slid past our ship, the darkness various and full of suggestion. Unseen tractors were grinding along the abutments, the cranes bent low, poised to pluck one of us off as we passed. We'd crossed open seas at 22 knots, and now we moved as if hobbled, at the speed of a slow bicycle, as if within the gradual unrolling of a scroll. I saw a painting leave the ship. In my sidelong glimpse, it appeared familiar. I might have seen it in one of the first-class lounges. Why would a painting be moved from the ship? I could not tell whether everything taking place was carefully legal or a frenzy of criminality. There were just the lit windows of the bridge with the three constant silhouettes, as if puppets guided the ship, following the orders of the harbor pilot. He came out a few times onto the open deck and whistled into the night to instruct a man he recognized on shore. A concurring whistle replied, and we'd hear the splash of a dropped chain, and the bow of the ship would jerk suddenly to re-angle itself to one side or the other. Cassius and I perched precariously on the bow railing, where we could witness the fragmentary tableaus below us. A merchant with his stall of food, engineers talking by a bonfire, the unloading of refuse. All of this we knew we would never see again. So we came to understand that small and important thing, that our lives could be large with interesting strangers who would pass us without any personal involvement. I remember still how we moved in that canal, our visibility muted, and those sounds that were messages from shore, and the sleepers on deck missing this panorama of activity. We were on the railing, bucking up and down. We could have fallen and lost our ship and begun another fate, as paupers or as princes. "Uncle," we shouted, if someone was close enough to distinguish our small figures. "Hello, Uncle!" And people would wave, fling us a grin. Everyone who saw us sliding by was an uncle that night. Someone threw us an orange from the desert. Cassius kept shouting for beedies, but they did not understand him. A dock worker held up something, a plant or an animal, but the darkness disguised it too well. Under a swaying cord of electrical light down there on shore was a man sitting at a makeshift table, filling out forms he handed to a runner, who caught up with the ship and flung the papers with a metal weight so they landed at the feet of one of the sailors. We never stopped moving. We passed the runner, as well as a man at the table furiously recording the charts of exchange, and a canteen cook beside an open fire roasting a thing whose odor was a gift, a desire in the night, a temptation to abandon the ship after all the European food we'd been eating for days. Cassius said, "That is what frankincense smells like." And so our ship continued, guided by these strangers. We were collecting what was fresh from land, bartering for objects shown on board. Who knows what was exchanged that night and what cross-fertilization occurred as the legal papers of entrance and exit were signed and passed back down to land while we entered and left the brief and temporary world of El Suez. There was a time in my late 20s when I suddenly had an urge to meet Cassius again. While I'd kept in touch with Ramadan and his family, I had not seen Cassius since the day our ship docked in England. And during this period, when I had the desire to see him, I came across an announcement in a London newspaper. There was a photograph of him. I would not have recognized the face except it had his name beside it. Older, darker, as different as I probably was from the boy I had been on this ship in the 1950s. It was an advertisement for a show of his paintings, and so I went into the city to a gallery on Cork Street. I went there not so much to see his art as to make contact with him, to have, I hoped, a long meal together and talk and talk and talk. I knew little of what had happened to him since our 3 weeks together, although I knew he had become a well-considered painter. That had surprised me. But was he as wild, I wondered, and had he remained as dangerous as he had seemed to me when I was a boy? Some grains of Cassius had, after all, remained in my system. I looked again at the announcement I'd cut out of the paper. of him leaning against a white wall with a hint of belligerence. But Cassius was not there. It was a Saturday afternoon. I got to the gallery and was told the show had opened a few evenings earlier and that Cassius had made his appearance then. I did not know much about the habits of the art world, and it was a disappointment. But his absence did not matter, for what I saw in the paintings was Cassius himself. There were large canvases that filled the 3 rooms of the Waddington Gallery, about 15 of them. They were all about that night in El Suez. The very same sulfur lights above the night activity that I still remembered, or at least began to remember that Saturday afternoon. And the open fires, the ancient-looking logbook being filled urgently by the scribe at the table in the crisp night air. I thought the paintings were abstractions at first. There was a sense in them that things were taking place on the edge of or just beyond the painted colors. But once I knew where we were, everything altered. All this enlarged me, and I did not know why. I suppose it clarified how close Cassius and I had been as brothers, for he also had witnessed the people I saw that night, with whom we had felt so oddly aligned, whom we would never see again, only there, in that night city of another world. We had not talked of this, but it had somehow come to both of us, and now they were here with us. I walked over to the visitor's book where people were expected to write comments. I put down the date and I wrote my name. Then I added, "Sorry to miss you, Mina." I left no address. I went outside, but something else held me, so I decided to walk back to the gallery again, this time glad there was hardly anyone else there. And when I understood what it was that drew me, I circled the gallery once more to make sure. I read somewhere that when people first celebrated the distinct point of view of Latigue's early photographs, it took a while before someone pointed out that it was a natural angle of a small boy with a camera looking up at the adults he was photographing. What I was seeing now in the gallery was the exact angle of vision Cassius and I had that night, from the railing, looking down at the men working in those pods of light. An angle of 45 degrees, something like that. I was back on the railing, watching, which was where Cassius was emotionally when he was doing these paintings. Goodbye, we were saying to all of them. Goodbye.
Thank you. You know, I love that passage because that very physical description of that movement, that transition, you know, they're going through the Suez Canal, allowed us to imagine this transition. We were always journeying, but here, concretely, it became a transition into something else. And almost as if the childhood innocence is then replaced by this knowledge of death. A death happens, and then another, and then there is this discovery of Emily's sadness and her tragedies. So it's a wonderful, what we had encountered in the previous section. You know, around this time I begin to teach at my college, so I'll go a little bit professorial on here. It was, you know, in the earlier part, we had the likeness of Miguel Street, and then, you know, there are these colorful characters. But this transition happens, and we get into something so much darker, I thought, and discovery of adult sorrows and a different kind of joy that is touched by pain. And still you keep the mystery. I was interested because there is this passage that happens about, you know, when you talk, when the narrator, Michael, talks about the discovery in a master class given by a filmmaker. There's a little note there about, we do not have more knowledge than the characters have about themselves. What do you think in this transition, what sort of knowledge is being gained by these characters, especially by the narrator, and what still remains a mystery to the narrator and therefore to us? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, when I began the book, I thought it was going to be a book mainly from the point of, and only from the point of view of an 11-year-old boy who was very naive and innocent and, you know, childish. And so
naked with innocence is the phrase you use, yeah.
And then the perception of the adults around him and the other boys is that point of view. And then something happens in some odd way, almost unconsciously, in the Suez Canal scene. You know, you're going into, as you say, it's going through a lens.
Yes.
And so that the next chapter, next scene where he goes to see the paintings of Cassius, who was 11 years old up to that point, now 25-year-old, 30-year-old person, and Mina is also an adult. So suddenly you're getting almost a flash forward. And so for the next 20 or 30 pages, we witness what Ramadan is like, and his life is like, and Mina's life is like. And then we go back to the ship. And I found what was actually heartbreaking in a way is you go back to the ship and the boys who are 11 years old, but now knowing what's going to happen to them.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the great, sadnesses of any life. Knowing what you know now and then remembering what you were then. So it really wasn't in that category of adulthood. And so there's a kind of voice, the narrative voice, and then I had to go back, and the narrative voice, the first part, which was just, quote, childish,
Yes.
now had to have an element of adult wisdom somewhere hidden in there to prepare you for this. So when he talks about Mr. Fonseca, there is a kind of adult point of view as well, even though it's from the point of view of a child.
Yes.
So I found that very interesting and to do, and it opened the book out for me in many ways.
What your writing allows me to do, talking about innocence, is that it allows me to experience over and over again the robbing of innocence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with Kip, falling in love with someone, and then the bomb is dropped. And that love is shattered, and his innocence is shattered too. He doesn't have any faith in the imperial enterprise anymore. He gets on a motorcycle and goes back.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene that I've never forgotten from that novel, which is the English patient is telling Hannah about what he used to do as in these journeys, and he talks about some other anthropologist whose tent he visits, whose tent he enters. The anthropologist has gone out for the day. As he's leaving, he looks up at the mirror and he sees behind him the bed. And the bed, there is, he says, there was a little mound there, as if a dog was hiding under the blankets. And then the next line is, he removes the blanket and he saw it was a little Arab girl tied there.
Mm-hmm.
Always what we are told about, just like in the other line from the book about the reports of the reports of the Geographical Society do not mention anything about adultery.
Mm-hmm.
Always what you're told about is that these objective texts, or these quote-unquote objective enterprises, always carry a burden of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Or, So is that something, isn't that an abiding passion of yours other than something that right now you're thinking about what happened to the child? Isn't that something that you always go back to? How is knowledge gained? How is dangerous knowledge gained?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, when I read some biographies, I often kind of skip the first 30 pages of the childhood because that doesn't seem too interesting to me. I mean, if I'm reading Chaplin's autobiography, or, that's like stolen Dickens, in many ways.
Yes.
And I'm more interested usually in the late teens, and then how you become an adult and get in trouble or you don't get in trouble. So, but in a way, this is the first book that does deal with childhood.
That's beautiful, yeah.
And so that kind of, I had to have a different kind of perception. There's an essay by Calvino on different elements about writing, and one of the chapters is called Lightness.
Mm-hmm.
And quite honestly, I don't remember what he said, but I remember it influenced me, and I wanted to have that lightness in this book. It moved fast, but there are these dark moments, and I think that's there. But and I guess the little moments of seeing the Arab girl, or witnessing something about Mr. Skidi or the captain in this book. It is a kind of, I mean, I'm still someone who's very influenced by collage as an art form. And I think one of the things that, there's a film critic whose name I've immediately forgotten right now, but he talks about the distinction between East and West. And the Western novel is very organized, it's very logical, there's a logical progression, it's a chronological progression, and there's a safety in that. Whereas if you look at Japanese film, it is made up of collage or bricolage. It's made up of lists, and it's only when you step back from the list that you begin to see a pattern of a life.
Yes.
And, you know, I'm someone who left Sri Lanka when I was 11 years old, but I think in some ways it was great to read this essay because I suddenly recognized that what I was doing was not so weird after all, that, you know, there is an element of, there's a more profound truth coming out of the collage, out of the list, out of discovering the story as you go along, or as the Japanese say, following the brush.
Yes.
You know, and I think that kind of, that's what, you know, makes me want to write. You know, I don't want to sit down and write a novel knowing everything about it before I begin it. You know, the element of discovery, the accidental discovery of the girl in the tent, or something in this novel. You know.
Yes. Tell me a little bit about that montage principle, because Michael is visiting somewhere and he's being instructed about the way in which a family's crest is patterned.
Mm-hmm.
There are the moons that describe something. And for Michael, this discovery, this very art historical or archaeological description is juxtaposed with the realization that Ramadin is the saint.
Mm-hmm.
That's that, you know, I wrote montage, you know.
Mm.
That's how you think, that's how you write.
It is how I think. You know, if you're thinking one thing and then over here someone's telling you a joke,
Yeah.
or giving you an important piece of, you know, information about sanitation,
Yes.
no matter how weird the other subject is, there is a connection, or you can make a connection, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's how I think. And maybe is that more of a voice of someone who began as a poet or not. I'm not sure. I mean, I always love history. So history is collage. It is
Yeah.
kind of juxtaposition of the good and the bad and the strange, you know. So, and how you place those sentences together changes the whole mood of a novel.
Yeah.
And so that kind of a lyric scene can suddenly kind of fall off the edge, you know, into something much darker.
Yeah. How are we doing in this conversation? Are we doing all right? Is there something that I've not asked you which you really wanted to share with the good people of Jaipur?
Not yet. Maybe it'll come out. We'll see.
There's one thing, we are drawing to a close, so maybe some people can give some thought to succinct inquiries. Last time when we were here, or 2 years ago when I was here, I said, we are now open to we'll open this to the floor, and the gentleman in the front row said to Hanif Qureshi that I was talking to, he said, Mr. Qureshi, are you circumcised? So, we'll try our hand, because Michael has talked about lightness, we'll try our hand at less pressing questions. There's one thing that I wanted to ask you, Michael. In Anil's Ghost, I think it is Gamin who says, American movies, English books, remember how they all end? The American or the Englishman gets on a plane and leaves. And he goes into this little account, which is very nice. The tired hero, a couple of words to the girl beside him, he's going home. So the war, to all purposes, is over. That's enough reality for the West. It's probably the history of the last 200 years of Western political writing. Go home, write a book, hit the circuit. I think that's brilliant. How do you avoid it, man? I want to know. Tell it to me.
Well, that's what. How do I avoid it? You can't avoid it, unfortunately,
Yes.
in this modern age. You know, I don't know. You have some irony towards good reviews, and you have irony towards bad reviews. So
Yes.
you know, they have to be equal. And I mean, I was lucky. You know, when the English Patient happened. I mean, when the English Patient became the English Patient.
Yes, yes,
you know,
yes.
I was already in the middle of Anil's Ghost, so I think that saved me. You know, I wasn't preoccupied with what was going on at that time. But I think, you know, it is a problem for writers. I know what they do about it. And I mean, for instance, I think that actually the person who has the best advice about this is Kutsi. Kutsi will not talk. You know.
No, he didn't take any questions when he spoke here last time.
You know, he never does interviews. I just totally admire the man. You know, he just goes off and is working on 5 other novels while we're doing an interview. You know.
Yeah. Okay, sorry then, no questions.
No questions. Okay.
Okay, all right. The lady there at the back.
Hang on, we need a mic.
नहीं आवाज नहीं आ रही. In Occupy Wall Street, the people would turn around and the question would be repeated by everyone. So we could do that. नहीं लेकिन आप बोलिए मैं I'll repeat it for the crowd.
My name is Madhushri. I'm from India Abroad News Service. My question to Mr. Ondaatje is, will you share with the readers the making of the English Patient? How did it all come about, the book? What were the inspirations? And how did you get down to writing it? What were the circumstances?
And you mean the book rather than the...
No, not the movie, but the book. Would be more interested in.
How did I what?
How did the English Patient come about?
How did it come about?
You say something about research also, because people also
Yeah.
wonder about
Okay. One of the things the parents of someone, a friend of mine, had worked in Egypt during the war, and they told me the story about this man called Al-Mashi going across the desert. So I tried to find out about him, but I didn't really know very much about him. But before that, I'd had this kind of, most of my novels begin with a small fragment of an image, and the image was of a nurse talking to a patient, or a patient talking to a nurse. And I thought it was going to be a very short novel of 120 pages with big type, rather like a Peter Handke novel, you know. And I did that all a night conversation, and then I started to kind of try and find out who the patient was, who the nurse was, and so that way I began to invent the story about those people. I do quite a bit of research in my when I'm writing, but very kind of lackadaisical research. I don't go and kind of intensely study the building of bridges at a certain period, but I kind of glance at it from sideways, so I don't know too much. I mean, sometimes you can do too much research, and as a result, you paint yourself into a corner. And I often find that if I want to find out about something, it's usually, and I can't find out, that's when I'm allowed more freedom, rather like the man saying it's very difficult to get a cow out of the ice. You know, that always helpful, so I can kind of, you know, so it's a kind of odd mixture of non-fiction. I have to begin with a kind of place and a time, a real place, real time, and so there's a kind of non-fictional landscape, and then I make fiction out of it or improvise off it. You know, I just know there's a singer called Kinky Friedman, and he had this great remark. He said, there's a very fine line between fiction and non-fiction, and I think I snorted it in 1976. And that's somehow how I feel about the two art forms. You know, they merge for me. So English Patient grew out of facts I picked up in the Royal Geographical Society, and at the same time, you know, it was invented as well. Just as the Cat's Table is really an invention of something that happened to me, because I don't really remember it very well.
Yes. A short question from the gentleman there in the second row.
Hi, Michael. Sorry, I'm Kim Singh with Asian News. I had a quick question for you. Could you talk a bit about the author as the patient? You see, what happens is normally authors and poets tend to be very reclusive individuals, except for, you know, our festival over here and doing the circuits. Suddenly you are you're made to stand in front of an audience and talk about a very private process. So could you talk about, you know, this whole media hype and celebrity, which swirls around authors who would rather not to do this circus?
Roughly the same question as before. I mean, I actually spend a lot of time alone. I mean, I spend about from about 9:30 till about 4 o'clock every day on my own in my office, you know, and I'm alone and never, you know, I'm surrounded by fictional characters all day. So that is a delight. And then every 6 years or so, I go and I kind of do readings from the book or whatever it is. And, you know, as long as you don't take the second part of it too seriously, I think it's, no, I mean, I do take it seriously as well. I mean, I love to hear people read and talk about their books myself, but I'd rather hear somebody else talk than myself talk.
There's a gentleman there, next to you, Katrina.
You just ended the conversation, Amitava, by talking about how when a war ends, there's this scene of saying, okay, goodbye. Whereas I want to know how you have avoided talking about the war in Sri Lanka, where there was no such goodbye. It's been described as a war without witness, and it was just recent. There are different kinds of wars, and of course it's there in the English patient, a bit of it, but what do you make of what's currently unraveling?
We are having some difficulty hearing you, boss.
I'm talking about the war in Sri Lanka which just ended, which did not have these goodbyes and somebody just taking a flight and saying the war's over, I'm coming home. With most Sri Lankan Tamil writers not being able to say, I'm going home, what does it mean? And for somebody who's from Sri Lanka.
Right. The passage that Amitava was talking about was from my book Anil's Ghost. Anil's Ghost is about the war in Sri Lanka. And it's a sort of key moment for me in the book because Anil, although her name is a boy's name, is a woman, and she's come back to Sri Lanka and gets involved with this political situation surrounded by the war. And I always imagined her book ending with her going off back to North America. And it was at that point I realized that the book had to stay in Sri Lanka and follow the fate of Garmini and Sarath. So I spent a lot of time, about 7 years, writing that book, and I came out of it, wiped out emotionally, certainly. And so, I mean, I've written other books which are not about the war, but I think that book is what I said what I wanted to say about the war. I mean, the war always continues in different forms, as it does today.
How are we doing in terms of time? Do you want us to close now? It's an hour. Okay. Okay, great. The lady there who's raised her hand. Yeah.
Indira Chandrasekhar. I run a short story magazine out of print. I very much appreciate your comment about the collage and the montage and the difference between the writing in the East and the West, because one of the reasons we have out of print committed to talking about fiction from the subcontinent is because of the difference in the way we perceive the short story. So that was just an appreciative comment. I am currently reading Running in the Family, and I am impressed really by the way in which you have an affection and a involvement at the same time as being an observer somehow of the family you're talking about. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's the main kind of preoccupation I have as a writer, perhaps. I've never kind of verbalized it as well as you have, but the novelist is, or the narrator is an observer, and at the same time he kind of hands the microphone over to the character, So unlike Nick Carraway, who sees everything over there from this persona, I do like Kip taking over the narrative, or Hannah taking over the narrative, or Caravaggio taking over the narrative, so that usually there are about 5 people, central people in each book, certainly in The Visidero and Anil's Ghost and English Patient. My first books were from the point of view of one person, Billy the Kid or Buddy Bolden. But it is a very kind of delicate thing. I was talking earlier on about having an adult voice alongside the child's voice, or an adult voice alongside the child's perception. When I edit, and I spend a lot of time editing a book, I go through many drafts. The real issue was how do you kind of have that adult voice where the child is witnessing something without invading it, without breaking the spell of the child. So it's kind of dodgy, but I'm really interested in having that, again, double perception,
The last questioner began her question by talking about her involvement with a small magazine. I just wanted to mention that Michael has been involved for a very long time with Linda Spalding in a magazine called Brick. About 15 years ago, I tried to publish in it unsuccessfully. And Michael has got flyers for that magazine in the bookstore. So you might want to grab a copy. All right. So from about 5 rows back from the last questioner, there was a lady there who has got her hand up. Oh, perhaps, okay. The gentleman with the beret, and then we can come back here.
Thank
Please.
you, sir. This is a question from Madoc, Ontario, Canada. I thought I'd blindside you here. You mentioned that you don't read the first 30 pages of biography, but the first 30 pages in your captain's table and the first 30 pages of Austerlitz are so important to the whole story coming forth. How do you explain that, sir?
No, I mean,
Biographies.
yeah, I meant non-fiction biographies, such as the Chaplin one. And I have changed my mind. But for instance, I definitely want you to read the first 30 pages of The Cat's Table and Austerlitz, if you can get there. It's interesting. I mean, I was read this long. I'm fascinated by Lucian Freud, and there was a big article about him, and I was reading the other day, and he's very interesting. And there was a wonderful remark made about him. They said he's only impatient when he leaves his studio. I thought, I can identify with that, because somehow you spend 7 hours a day in a room and you're not impatient at all, and suddenly you're in the real world and you're kind of dealing with a bus or a lineup. It's very different. I don't know what that's got to do with your question, but the fact that you're from Madoc, Ontario is weird enough, which is very close to where I live.
Yes.
No, I mean, obviously, I think it's because I hadn't read all those things that I kind of approached the childhood thing maybe a bit more freshly, Not that I shouldn't have read those things before.
Yeah.
I'm
The lady there. Yeah.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Firstly, I just wanted to thank you for all these fantastic characters to us in the course of your books. My question is very simple. Who would you say is your favorite character? I mean, you spend a lot of hours, hearing their voices in your head. So who would you say is your favorite character?
It's a kind of almost a political question now. I mean, it's like, which child do you like best? I don't know. I mean, I think I liked Hannah in the English Patient. I liked Kip. I mean, I felt very close to Kip, obviously. But I liked...
Did you like Hannah more after Juliette Binoche played her?
No, I liked her just as much before. In this book, I love Miss Laskiti, because, she was sort of like a wallpaper for the first 50 pages, and I thought, what is she doing here? Doesn't sound very interesting, but I think she's interesting. And then she has a little aria later on, and I found her absolutely fascinating. And I think what happens to me actually is that I'm writing a book, and I'm sort of waiting for this strange central character to arrive. And I think in English Patient, suddenly Kip arrives about page 130 or something like that. I had no plan for him to arrive. I hadn't thought about him at all. And then he comes into the story and he becomes this little angel, in a way. Angel in the sense that he kind of saves the book. And in Anil's Ghost, it was the Dr. Garmini. I guess actually Garmini is the one I love the best.
Yes.
Garmini comes in halfway through, the brother of Sarath, and I had no plans for him to be in the book, and he just took over for me. He became the kind of moral center. And I think they become, I mean, I like all the other characters, but I think Mr. Skeety and Garmini and Kip are sort of moral centers. Not that they're very, very good people, but they are a core of what we can hold on to in a very uncertain world.
Who's going to ask the next question? Would you mind if I just ask the gentleman at the very back, because we haven't gone... Yeah. Sir. We are looking for depth in our questioning order.
Myself, Suresh Bajoria. Welcome to the Jaipur. Sir, I want to ask you, you said in the beginning that you don't plan your plot, you just start it and as the story goes on. So I just wondering, do you write your plots by your memories more, or as the circumstances happens or the newses and culture goes ahead?
I'm not sure what all those other. I mean, I usually begin with that image. I begin with a small fragment. The two girls on a farm in Divisadero. In this one, it was a boy getting onto a ship, and all I knew, apart from the boy getting onto the ship, was that it was going to end with him getting off the ship. So I had a kind of A and Z in the story. Nothing. I knew nothing else apart from that. So then what happens is you're making an adventure. You're putting 2 and 2 together and making 10. Strangely, you know. So I think the fact that it was a cat's table. You know, I thought it was going to be a book about a boy alone. Then he makes 2 friends, and then there's a community of the cat's table of about 8 or 9 people. And suddenly it became a book not just about the one boy, but about a group of people. And it becomes a story about how they will eventually land when they get to England and what becomes of them. So whether it's the Asuntha, the young girl, or the father who's the prisoner, or what happens to Emily. And so it becomes less a book about just the boy Minor and about really about a whole tribe of people arriving and what happens to them. Because, I mean, in a way, that's the story of our generation, of my generation anyway. You know, how do you get to here from there?
Yes.
You know, it's such a central story, and I mean, it's been very interesting with this book coming out. You know, people come up to me and say, "I was on the Oronze too, and here I brought you the menu," you know, and it's been quite amazing. Not just people in Asia or in Canada, but people in Texas. You know, somehow the Oronze seem to have taken half the population of the world from, you know, Asia to North America.
But can't I press you to say that plot is not so important?
Well, I think plot you can replace, perhaps, I'm guessing, you can replace plot with design.
Yes.
You know, the way, if you see a collage and you see yellow paper and shiny yellow paper and porous blue paper and some words from a cigarette box, and the artist makes that frame of various colors, but when you step back, you are seeing a pattern, or you see a story, or you see a design, rather like the way I was talking about in the Japanese following the brush.
Yes.
You know, the collage collects things, and you know, can tell a story. But you're doing it in a way. I'm doing it with words and with real characters. So, you know, Miss Lasky does not exist on her own. She exists alongside Emily, and that Emily reveals as much about Miss Lasky as her own history. And for me, that's what's really interesting about collaging characters, and especially this book, where it's like a kind of French farce on a ship. You know, you've got 25 people entering and leaving strange doors and jumping overboard and stuff like that.
Okay, we have come to our last question. Please ask a scandalous question. Who's going to do that? Gentleman there who's waving his arm. And a short one, very short one. Multi-voiced, yes. Right.
What are the dangers in expecting a single voice to represent a story or a situation?
Oh, okay. I don't think there's a big danger in it. It's just, for me, more interested to kind of have the various voices. You know, it's like the John Berger remark. Have more than one point of view to a story. I mean, listen, Beckett, there's nothing better, you know. Beckett can have someone on stage talking for 2 hours, and I'll be satisfied with that. Or, you know, there's nothing wrong with The Great Gatsby. It's a great novel. But for me, in this time place, in this generation, to me, I believe, you know, I'm more interested in writing a book with various points of view, kind of merging and colliding. And so that by the end of something like The Cat's Table or a Divisadero or whatever the book is, there's a sense of a period of time where that's the kind of general sense of it, you know, as opposed to just one monologue. I don't object to the, you know, listen, Marlowe in Conrad is a great invention, you know, perfect, but, you know, I'm just more interested in this.
Michael, do you usually read to the audience the size of a small Sri Lankan village?
Yeah.
All right.
Usually a small tennis club.
Small tennis club. You've been a brilliant speaker. Thank you so much. And you've been a great audience. Thank you. Michael is going to sign his books at the bookstore immediately following this event, sir.
Please join me again in thanking very warmly Michael Ondaatje and Amitava Kumar. Both authors will be signing in the book tent, which is at the far end of the property. That way, past the Durbar Hall and opposite the Mogul tent. If you are going to move on from this venue, please do make sure you take all your personal belongings with you. We have a short break, and at 12:30, the new sessions will commence. I'll just give you a breakdown of what's happening at the IDFC Durbar Hall. There's little magazines, Voices from Below. At the Bank of America Mogul tent, there is the disappointment of Obama. In the RP Sanjeev Goenka Group Baitak, that's Rajasthan Ekkoj, the spirit of Rajasthan. And here at the Tata Steel front lawns, we have Kili Batisi, poetry reading and interactions. That's at 12:30, starting in about 10 minutes. We look forward to seeing you back here for the next session. Thank you.